Excellencies, colleagues, partners, and friends. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us both here physically in New York and virtually via Zoom. Thank you for bearing with us through those technical difficulties. These hybrid meetings combine all the benefits of a physical meeting with the technical difficulties of convening online. My name is Jason Ipe. I'm with the Global Center on Cooperative Security. We're grateful to be organizing this meeting in partnership with the permanent missions of the UAE and Norway, and with the International Criminal Police Organization, INTERPOL. It's my pleasure to moderate today's panel discussion on our common agenda, Secretary General Guterres' vision for the future of global cooperation and the potential impacts and opportunities of the common agenda for UN counterterrorism efforts. We'll first turn to His Excellency Ambassador Mohammed Abu Shahab, Deputy Permanent Representative of the United Arab Emirates to the United Nations, the physical host of today's meeting. Ambassador.
Thank you, Jason. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, whether you're here in person or joining us online, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the UAE mission. We're honored to co-host this event at such a critical juncture with the permanent mission of Norway and in partnership with Interpol and the Global Center on Cooperative Security. In the Secretary General's Our Common Approach report, he states that we are at an inflection point in history. We fully agree with this point, especially as we see traditional security threats multiply and new non-conventional threats test the very basis of our multilateral system. The Secretary General's Common Agenda puts forward a comprehensive roadmap to both upgrade and adapt multilateral governance to the needs of the 21st century. The UAE applauds the Secretary General's timely initiative, and we were pleased to see the resolution welcoming the agenda adopted by consensus. Our Common Agenda is built around 12 broad commitments. From engagement with youth to strengthening digital cooperation, each commitment has implications for our common effort in countering terrorism and violent extremism, whether in addressing root causes, building stronger means of cooperation, or improving our tools and frameworks. More directly, the report sets forth a new agenda for peace, which focuses on adapting our systems of peace and security to better cope with emerging risks and unconventional threats. To this end, it is necessary to include evolving terrorist threats. Improving our approach to counterterrorism is of the utmost importance, particularly when respect to prevention and strengthening cooperation between member states, UN entities, and other stakeholders. We regard the One UN approach as critical to establish a robust and coordinated global response to the global challenge of terrorism. Efforts to prevent and counter terrorism and violent extremism involve different parts of the UN system, including the Security Council and its Counterterrorism Committee, or CTC. Among the CTC's executive directorate's important contributions to this global response are its assessment visits to member states, outreach activities, and research. The UAE believes that there are numerous concrete ways in which our common agenda can further guide UN counterterrorism efforts. Allow me to focus on two of these. First, in his report, the Secretary General describes the value of tolerance as fundamental. In order to spread a culture of tolerance and pluralism, which can prevent extremism and terrorism, we need to empower communities, especially women, youth, and religious leaders, to disseminate values that counter violence and hatred. This remains a key priority for the UAE and will continue to focus on these issues when we join the Security Council next month. Second, the Secretary General also highlights that women and girls have to be at the center of security policy. We firmly agree in this regard and believe that effective strategies to counter extremism and terrorism require inclusive approaches and partnerships that represent all members of our society. It is essential that such approaches integrate a gender perspective and promote women's participation and leadership. We also believe in the importance of regional and sub-regional efforts to prevent and respond to security challenges, including terrorism and violent extremism. It's essential to support such regional organizations and frameworks in order to enhance cooperation, facilitate information exchange, and share best practices. Even as we promote a one UN approach, the role and significance of regional and sub-regional efforts cannot be overlooked. We hope that today's discussions will offer a variety of new perspectives on how we can promote peace and prevent conflict, including through countering terrorism. I thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to hearing from today's briefers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your warm words of welcome and for hosting us in your lovely new premises here. It's my pleasure now to introduce ASG Volker Turk, who is Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Coordination in the Executive Office of the Secretary General at the United Nations headquarters in New York. In this role, he ensures coherence in the strategic analysis provided to the Secretary General and conducts system-wide coordination, including on the Secretary General's call to action for human rights, his initiatives on COVID-19, and his report on our common agenda to address future challenges.
Well, thank you very much. And also big thanks to the UAE, Norway, INTERPOL, and the Global Center for organizing this event. It's really great that we actually have a discussion about our common agenda in the context of counterterrorism, which, by the way, was also one issue that was particularly flagged in our engagement with member states. When the Secretary General launched the report, there were some who felt that there could have been perhaps more references to terrorism. But I hope that when I briefly outline the genesis of our common agenda report, but also some of the areas that speak directly to terrorism issues, that we will have assuaged that particular concern. The report, as you know, was a response to the UN 75 declaration on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And that declaration had 12 commitments, very clear commitments. We were asked, Secretary General was asked to produce this report of how to advance our common agenda to present and future challenges. So it was, in a way, based on the past and the present, an outlook for the future. And as you mentioned, it described this inflection point in history between breakthrough and breakdown scenarios if we are not taking action in a number of areas now that are of particular importance. And there is a paradox that we also see play out in the context of terrorism. We learned from COVID how interconnected, we should say, we learned from COVID yet again how interconnected the world is. But we have also seen that some parts of the population have, as a result, gone into a much more inward-looking type mentality and mental space. You see this in particular in areas of those segments of population who really fear what is happening, and as a result are also drawn to a thinking that is what the psychologists would describe as groupthink, or sociologists, and that sometimes can be prone to more extremist views, and that's almost an example of some of the things that we see happening. What the report describes in particular is this fractured relationship that we see in many parts of the world between the societies and the institutions that are supposed to serve them, but also the fractured relationship within societies. And there are many reasons for it. I think you in particular within the terrorism community are studying them and analyzing them. And I think the Common Agenda report really wants to go to the heart of it by elaborating upon the notion of the social contract. The social contract meaning the rebuilding of a fractured social contract that would otherwise be prone to extremist views or terrorism. I think the social contract also is a deeper analysis behind why some people feel excluded, why they feel desperate, why they feel that despite data and statistics, they are hard done by, and the failure sometimes also of political systems not to respond to their needs and to their aspirations, not understanding exactly what it is that they want. So I think that's part of this social contract discussion that we hope to achieve through a more in-depth analysis and taking forward the common agenda. So the rebuilding of trust based on values, based also on truth, on the scientific and evidence base that we all need so much is extremely important. You mentioned also the gender dimension. I think the gender dimension is extremely important in this regard as well, and I'll talk to those areas. I think there are actually 6 areas in the Common Agenda report that are of particular relevance to counterterrorism. The first one is the particular emphasis that the Common Agenda report makes on investing in prevention and peace building, essentially addressing the root causes of social tensions, looking at what is conflict today and why is conflict leading to certain results, but also it then ties up with the prevention of violent extremism agenda that many of you have been engaged in. So this whole emphasis on prevention, analyzing it also in the context of today's challenges is certainly an area that has been elaborated upon quite a bit in the Common Agenda. The second is the supporting regional prevention efforts. I mean, the Sahel is a good example. Making sure that we really benefit from local and regional knowledge and dynamics and can ensure that that feeds into counterterrorism strategies. The third one is reshaping responses to all forms of violence, not dissecting violence into different aspects. We know that violence today, I mean, there is more and more analysis about misogyny, violent misogyny misogyny and violent extremism, that these studies have come through. And so what does this actually tell us then about violence as a reaction to different ways? And it's important to understand this. The fourth area is women and girls at the center of security policy. The Women, Police and Security agenda of the Security Council is one that has put that emphasis very much, but we know that in the efforts in the context of counterterrorism, I think the Office of Counterterrorism has often tried to also make sure that we don't only focus on the perpetrators, but also on the victims, because sometimes we talk more about the perpetrators than the victims, and very often we see the gender dimension come through in that regard. The fifth one is reducing strategic risks. I mean, terrorism is obviously a strategic risk. Violent extremism is a strategic risk. And how do we deal with strategic risks in a comprehensive, integrated manner and try to address it? And it feeds into what you have mentioned, the so-called new agenda for peace, because it's part of a strategic risk analysis. And that's the sixth point, the whole emphasis that the report makes about the future, about strategic foresight, about analysis, and making sure that we analyze different scenarios and we envision futures in different ways, and then ask ourselves, if we don't want a certain scenario to become reality, what is it that we need to do today in our realm of responsibility in order to prevent this from happening? I think that's extremely important. So there are also different hooks in the common agenda that are of relevance in this whole ecosystem of counterterrorism. Education. The Secretary General wants to hold a Transforming Education Summit next year, not least also because of, well, if you look at SDG 4 and how much SDG 4 has suffered as a result of COVID, it's clear that there's a lot to be done. And including in the whole area, I mean, we know how much education and the content of education is linked to counterterrorism and prevention of violent extremism efforts. There's the whole area of the digital side, the social media platforms. We have just had, again, discussions with Facebook, for example, or Meta, as they're called now, and their oversight committee, because we see in so many conflict situations today, in the pre-conflict phase, how social media platforms are used to incite hatred, to spread disinformation, to almost be a platform for certain extremist agendas. And it's extremely important that through a digital compact, or through a global digital compact, that we tackle this issue in particular. The other area is the World Social Summit in 2025, because a lot of issues around labor, around housing, are grievances that people have, real grievances that they face. And again, hopefully through focus on social protection schemes, these can be addressed. And of course, in 2023, the idea of a summit of the future, where we really look, what is it that we expect from the world? What is it that the world expects from us in the United Nations to advance some of those big difficulties that we face today, including in this area of security policy and counterterrorism? We have within the UN, through the Office of Counterterrorism, the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, the 1216 monitoring team, and the entities that participate in the Counterterrorism Global Compact, a very robust system now that tries to achieve the global analysis, the strategic foresight, but also the policy development that is so necessary. So the question that we have is, are there other areas that need to be strengthened to make this issue more effective, more networked, and more interactive? And whatever one can do about this is going to be very important, because a lot of the root causes that we see on terrorism require this integrated, you talked about one UN approach, but it probably means a one society approach, a one government approach across societies and across countries, a new multilateralism. So for us, the big question is always the governance side. How can we improve the governance side, including in relation to counterterrorism, building very much on the achievements that the different entities of the UN system have been able to do in the last couple of years. So thank you very much for the invitation and for your focus on this very important report.
Thank you, ESG Turk, for those very insightful remarks and excellent framing of the issues to be discussed and how CT fits within and relates to the issues in our common agenda. Indeed, as the Assistant Secretary General laid out, the common agenda contains recommendations across broad areas related to renewing solidarity and trust between peoples and future generations, a new social contract anchored in human rights, better management of critical global commons, and global public goods that deliver equity and sustainability for all. It proposes a new agenda for peace centered on reduction of risks, cooperation to prevent and counter terrorism, strengthening of international foresight, and realizing the critical roles of women and youth. The agenda responds to the mandates given in the Declaration of the Commemoration of the 75th Anniversary of the United Nations, adopted by the heads of state and government, and builds on the Secretary General's prevention priority, ongoing institutional reform efforts, and his recent call to action for human rights. In today's discussion, panelists will explore how the common agenda could affect or perhaps even be used to optimize the UN's counterterrorism efforts and its supporting architecture. Now, as you all have seen, we have a very packed agenda for today's meeting. Our panel includes His Excellency Ambassador Tariq Ladeb, with the permanent representative of the Republic of Tunisia to the UN and the chair of the Counterterrorism Committee, Mr. Kali Brown, a country manager and liaison to ASEAN with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Mr. Rafi Gregorian, Director and Deputy to the Undersecretary General with the UN Office on Counterterrorism, Ms. Leila Bukhari, a terrorism expert and former Deputy Minister at the Prime Minister's Office and at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway, Mr. Greg Hines, Director of Counterterrorism with INTERPOL, and Ms. Fatima Askira, Founder and Executive Director of the Borno Women's Development Initiative. And as I find myself at the end of a all-male panel here, I would like to mention that we had greater gender diversity of in-person participants previously, but circumstances conspired against us and resulted in fully all-male in-person panel, but we do have women joining virtually as well. And following the panelists' presentations, we'll also of course, invite contributions from the virtual floor, from civil society and other representatives joining online. So now it's my honor to welcome His Excellency Mr. Tariq Ladeb, the permanent representative of the Republic of Tunisia, for his remarks. Ambassador Ladeb, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jason. Excellencies, distinguished participants, as chair of the Security Council Committee established pursuant to Resolution 1373 concerning counterterrorism, or CTC, I wish to begin by thanking the co-organizers, Norway and United Arab Emirates, and their event partners, the Global Center on, on Cooperative Security, and INTERPOL for organizing today's panel discussion. I wish to welcome, as a basis for further consideration by member states, the submission of the rich and substantive report of the Secretary General entitled Our Common Agenda. Excellencies, distinguished participants, our topic of discussion addresses one of the most important and salient issues on the UN's global peace and security agenda. We should consider it in the context of evolving global threats and challenges, international, regional, and national endeavors, and all the relevant resolutions of the Security Council on peace and security, and in particular on counterterrorism and countering violent terrorism conducive to terrorism. A few key elements should be kept in mind. The terrorism landscape is volatile and fast evolving, and global terrorism trends and challenges, which have been aggravated by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, require preventive, preemptive, and proactive responses. There is a close interrelationship between maintaining international peace and security, sustaining economic and social development, and promoting respect for human rights. International efforts should be collective and holistic, involving the participation of all relevant stakeholders and all sectors of society. The Security Council has set out a broad range of fundamental guidelines and requirements on counterterrorism and countering violent extremism, including, but not limited to, the following. Terrorism continues to pose a serious threat to international peace and security. Terrorism, in all its forms and manifestations, is to be strongly condemned. Terrorism cannot and should not be associated with any religion, nationality, or ethnic group. Member states have the primary responsibility in countering terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. Member states must ensure that any measures taken to counter terrorism comply with all their obligations under international law, in particular international human rights, international refugee, and international humanitarian law. Member states are required to develop and implement comprehensive strategies to effectively address the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism and adopt a whole of government and whole of society approach. Excellencies, distinguished participants, this year has seen two significant counterterrorism-related activities of the United Nations. First, the biannual review of the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy, with the adoption of the related General Assembly resolution, and second, the Security Council mandated special meeting of the CTC commemorating the 20th anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 1373 and the establishment of the CTC, with the issuance of an outcome document. These activities have provided excellent opportunities for member states, UN entities, international and regional organizations, and other players from civil society, academia, and the private sector to exchange views and reflections on the progress that has been achieved, the challenges that we face, and the way forward to effectively address terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. Within the overall framework of the UN counterterrorism architecture, the CTC, supported by its Executive Directorate, or CPED, is at the forefront of those endeavors, spearheading efforts to fulfill the tasks and activities set forth in the relevant Council resolutions. The work of the CTC notably includes monitoring and assessing member states' compliance with their international obligations, facilitating the delivery of technical assistance to member states in need, promoting the policy papers of the Council and the CTC, as well as the relevant international standards, codes, and best practices, and engaging in informed consideration of new terrorism threats and trends. This work also aims to ensure balanced implementation of the 4 pillars of the global strategy. As you are all aware, the CTC is currently considering the renewal of CTED's mandate pursuant to Resolution 2395 of 2017 and will shortly submit the relevant document to the Council to assist in its review. It is my hope that today's discussion will help us all better understand what has been achieved this far, the challenges we face, what remains to be accomplished, and how we can further strengthen our cooperation and enhance our efforts to combat the global terrorism threat. We must work closely together to identify ways to react swiftly and comprehensively to new terrorism trends and challenges, engage all sectors of society in a meaningful manner, make our all-UN approach more effective, efficient, and complementary to one another, while also avoiding competition, duplication, and repetition, adopt human rights compliant and gender and age-sensitive counterterrorism measures, and ensure impactful deliverables for capacity building. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Can you hear me? Yep. Thank you, Ambassador. I'm now pleased to thank you. I'm now pleased to introduce Mr. Kali Brown, Country Manager and Liaison to ASEAN at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. He's joining us virtually today from Indonesia. Colleague, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jason, and I hope you all can hear me very well. Good night from Jakarta, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. I bring you greetings from Jakarta, Indonesia. Certainly on behalf of Ms. Valerie Julian, the resident coordinator for Indonesia, and my own agency, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. It is certainly an honor for me to be here with you as we discuss our common agenda in the context of counterterrorism and preventing violent extremism. There are countless examples of the link between sustainable development and counterterrorism in the country where I'm currently serving. But I will return to that a few minutes later. With the few minutes that I have, though, I wanted to begin today's remarks by highlighting Mosul, a city thousands of miles away in northern Iraq. Mosul, as you all know, served as the capital of the Islamic State's so-called caliphate in Iraq, where at its peak in 2015 sprawled against a landmass larger than Great Britain. Before the Islamic State barbaric takeover, I recall during my time in Iraq that Mosul was many things, along with it being a magnet for foreign fighters. But one of those things was also a poorly governed city where you could not even get your trash collected. And so the Islamic State was mostly known for its brutality, but it also ruled through bureaucracy as well as brutality. It gathered taxes, it ran marriage offices, and yes, it collected municipal garbage with surprising efficiency. This is in no way intended to trivialize the atrocities perpetrated by the Islamic State in Mosul, or anywhere else for that matter. But it is to say that in places where development is uneven, where corruption is pervasive, and where governments fail their citizens, extremist groups use the absence of legitimate government to easily gain a foothold. We are seeing that now in the Sahel, where days ago 7 Togolese peacekeepers and 1 Egyptian were killed in a heinous terrorist attack in Mali. In the Chad Basin, where climate disruption contributes to pressure on institutions and hinders their capacity to provide public service, Boko Haram has gained new recruits. It has done so by providing promises of protection, income, and justice, and exploiting people's grievances and mistrust towards government. I had to highlight these as they emphasize why a common agenda is vital in the context of counterterrorism, and particularly the notion at its heart, a new social contract for humanity. When we compare the Sustainable Development Goals to the Millennium Development Goals, the big difference is how integrated the SDGs are. None is achievable without the others. Our common agenda takes this a step further. It affirms the fact that everything is interdependent, but it truly centers on multilateralism. As COVID-19 has reminded us, and as one of the speakers so eloquently stated before, none of us is safe until we're all safe. And we need global solutions to transnational problems. Violent extremism is inherently transnational in the Levant and in the Maghreb, in the Sahel, even in the Philippines and across the Sulawesi Sea. If we want to tackle violent extremism, we can't do it without tackling gender inequalities, the relationship between women's leadership and inclusion in peace building, and the likelihood of peace building efforts success is well established. As in the Sahel example I referred to earlier, we can't tackle violent extremism without addressing climate change. And we can't do it without tackling labor inequalities, injustice, and corruption. It is instructive that we are gathered here only days after observing 2 international days, anti-corruption and human rights. Corruption is often a basis for the distrust in institutions that generates disillusionment and certainly enables extremist ideology to take root. Corruption is the antithesis of development. Corruption is essentially stealing development from people. This too is a transnational problem. Now, because corruption is only possible in one state, when another state turns a blind eye to it, for example, through tacit encouragement of fiscal paradises. This April, the US Internal Revenue, IRS, as many of us know it, the commissioner estimated the United States alone loses $1 trillion every year in unpaid taxes, mostly because of tax evasion by wealthy companies. Now imagine if all that money could be channeled towards development instead. Say goodbye to the SDG financing gap. Now, ladies and gentlemen, here in Indonesia, the UN counterterrorism and PVE efforts principally happen through what we have blended the Peace Hub and its affiliated project, which we have are currently implementing, the GUYU project, a project that is funded by the Human Security Trust Fund. Now, this joint program of 3 UN agencies, UN Women, UNODC, and UNDP, along with one of our NGO partners, the Wahid Foundation. Now, the Peace Hub encapsulates these types of multilateral intervention. And we believe that these are, and the only way that we can stop this scourge. Now, the Peace Hub, it brings together these several agencies together with government ministries and, of course, our non-governmental partners to take an integrated approach to counterterrorism and violent extremism. It emphasizes gender, human rights, and certainly a climate focus so that we can share resources and minimize blind spots despite the pandemic. Now, I think we have been so successful in our efforts that the Indonesian National Counterterrorism Agency has developed a parallel Indonesia Knowledge Hub, which mirrors the Peace Hub structure and its objectives. Now, we know our approach is working on the local level as well, and our common agenda makes it clear that the approach we need to take should be done on a multinational level as well. Obviously, preventing violent extremism is never just a matter of, sorting out the municipal garbage collection. It's not just a matter of any one thing, but that's why a multilateral approach to human security is so vital. Because the stronger the social contract we have, is the more difficult it becomes for extremist groups to offer compelling alternative narratives. And so, in a world destabilized by this looming crisis, climate crisis, and pandemics, vast disparities in access to resources, racial and economic injustice, and certainly gender inequalities, it is clear that it's time for a new social contract. And to have any chance of sticking that contract, it must be multilateral, authored by all of us, and designed to leave no one behind. And so I just wanted to share these thoughts with you. And so I thank you for the opportunity to share them with you as well. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kali. Our next speaker, also joining us virtually, is Mr. Rafi Gregorian. Rafi is the Director and Deputy to the Undersecretary General at the UN Office on Counterterrorism. Rafi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or very late night to you, Kali, out there in Indonesia, and wherever the rest of you may be joining us. My thanks to the permanent missions of Norway and the United Arab Emirates, as well as our partners from INTERPOL and the Global Center for organizing this timely event. This has been a year of deep reflection regarding the international response to terrorism. 20 years have passed since the Security Council adopted Resolution 1373 and galvanized international counterterrorism efforts in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. This past June, we held a successful second UN Counterterrorism Week, during which member states agreed on the most substantive and comprehensive review of the global counterterrorism strategy since its adoption 15 years ago. The General Assembly also noted in its declaration on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations that terrorism remains a serious threat to international peace and security and a priority for member states. As we heard from Assistant Secretary General Turk, the Secretary General shares these concerns. His report on our common agenda identifies terrorism as a strategic security risk that requires continued cooperation as part of a new agenda for peace. While the Secretary General has often noted that terrorist groups are present in many of the protracted conflicts with which the international community is grappling, it is useful to pause for a moment to consider what this means. First of all, when referring to terrorism and protracted conflicts, we are speaking mainly of Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and their affiliates or splinter groups onto which they have grafted themselves in local insurgencies, often increasing their lethality profile and their regional or even international reach. Phenomena presaged in 2009 by John McKinley's Insurgent Archipelago and David Kilcullen's Accidental Guerrilla. As a result, strategies that were effective for countering relatively small terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda, as it was in 2001, proved to be of limited value against a terrorist insurgency like Daesh. At its height, Daesh included not only huge numbers of Iraqi and Syrian nationals, but also attracted an estimated 40,000 plus fighters from over 80 countries. It was in response to this foreign terrorist fighter phenomenon that the Security Council adopted Resolution 2178, obliging all member states to criminalize acts related to traveling for the purposes of engaging in terrorist activity. But Resolution 2178 also included several operative paragraphs related to all of society approaches to counter violent extremism as a means of addressing the factors pushing and pulling recruits to join Daesh. Subsequent resolutions addressed related issues such as countering terrorist narratives or rehabilitating and reintegrating former terrorist offenders, themes which the General Assembly went on to address in this year's biennial review of the 2006 Global Counterterrorism Strategy, the first pillar of which is addressing the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism. In my view, these resolutions collectively have moved counterterrorism from a field originally designed to defeat the use of terrorist tactics by small groups into an enterprise that is more akin to counterinsurgency, which to be conducted effectively requires a comprehensive political, economic, social, military, and law enforcement response conducted in a human rights compliant manner, which is how we conceptualize counterterrorism today, despite the fact that neither insurgency nor terrorism has a single internationally agreed definition. The lines between peace building, peacemaking, and peacekeeping set down in the original Agenda for Peace have now become thoroughly blurred. So how does this relate to our common agenda and a new agenda for peace? Well, a successful traditional counterinsurgency, which historically may take a decade or more, addresses whatever legitimate grievances may be fueling popular support for insurgents. Winning hearts and minds, a term used in the successful Malayan counterinsurgency of the 1950s, is fundamentally about rebooting the social contract, which is at the root of our common agenda. So in developing the new agenda for peace, we need to ask ourselves whether the threat landscape in 2023, shaped by transformative technologies, will require another step change like the one represented from moving from UNSCR 1373 to UNSCR 2178, or how to adapt today's whole of government and whole of society approaches to stay relevant to the evolving nature of the terrorist threat. That is because while terrorists and violent extremists exploit growing polarization, dissatisfaction, and distrust within societies, the interplay between terrorism, weak governance, armed conflict, and organized crime adds complexity to an already difficult challenge. Yet we also simply cannot artificially conflate these challenges. They each require appropriate instruments, the right amount of attention, and counterterrorism needs to be integrated as part of sophisticated and comprehensive responses. Counterterrorism intersects with big public policy objectives for member states and the United Nations, including sustainable development, sustaining peace and human rights, objectives that are at the heart of the Secretary General's report on our common agenda. Therefore, countering terrorism is not only a part of the common agenda, it is also intertwined with progress across the common agenda. In this vein, there are strong synergies between the vision set out by the Secretary General in his report in terms of both objectives and methods, and the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy in its review. Indeed, there are strong synergies with the efforts we are already undertaking to reinvigorate multilateral and inclusive counterterrorism cooperation. Since its establishment in 2017, UNOCT has prioritized the development of partnerships and breaking silos to better address terrorism and its underlying drivers through such a holistic and inclusive manner. The Secretary General's Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact is one of the largest coordination frameworks at the United Nations across the organization's 3 pillars of work, geared towards delivering as one UN in support of member states by bringing together 43 entities and connecting them with focal points from over 130 member states. We have further strengthened our longstanding work on victims of terrorism, taking concrete action to mainstream human rights and a gender perspective across our mandated functions, and enhanced our engagement with civil society and the youth towards a better, more sustainable and effective paradigm to prevent and counter terrorism. The high-level conference on human rights and counterterrorism and the Global Congress of Victims of Terrorism that we will convene next year will further advance this important work, as will the new human rights and gender section we are standing up next month within UNOCT. Consistent with the United Nations 2.0 proposed by the Secretary General, we have positioned ourselves to leverage behavioral sciences and innovation for cutting-edge policy and programming, including through our international hub in Doha. UNOCT is embracing the opportunities offered by new technologies to connect, collaborate, and deliver more efficiently and effectively, while supporting member states to both mitigate the vulnerabilities caused by transformative technologies and harness responsibly their potential. So there is much already achieved and much ongoing upon which to build, but still so much more is needed in our collective pursuit of a world free from terrorism. The UN's Counterterrorism Weeks and a series of regional high-level conferences we've convened since 2008 have spurred renewed policy dialogue with member states, parliamentarians, regional organizations, and civil society to foster greater cooperation and guide capacity building. The third Counterterrorism Week, including the next review of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy, will be in June 2023, just a few months ahead of the Summit of the Future proposed by the Secretary General. In the run-up to these next milestones, UNOCT looks forward to working with member states, the UN family, under the Secretary General's leadership, and other partners to make progress in preventing and countering terrorism as part of a new agenda for peace. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rafi, for those excellent remarks. I'm now pleased to welcome Ms. Leila Bukhari to the virtual floor. Leila is a terrorism expert and previously served as a deputy minister at the Prime Minister's office and with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway. Leila, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jason. And thank you to the missions of the United Arab Emirates and Norway for inviting me to join the discussion and to offer a few short remarks on this topic. I'm honored to be here with all of you, and greetings from Oslo, from Norway. Thank you also to the Global Center and INTERPOL for convening this session. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, many of whom I see are online here with us today. We're slowly reaching the end of a year that has marked 20 years since the gruesome attacks of 9/11 in the US, and here in Norway, 10 years since 22nd of July 2011, the attacks on the government building and the island of Utøya. A year that has involved and still involves discussions that many of my colleagues before have mentioned, discussions of the review of the UN counterterrorism strategy and the renewal of the different mandates, amongst the many other discussions on UN CT efforts. We're also seeing an evolving threat landscape out there. We see in Afghanistan, where the Taliban is back in power. And while we're not entirely sure what this might mean, what effect this has had or will have on extremists and terrorist groups around the world, we know that it may have inspired or agitated groups not only in the region, but also around the world. We've also seen the rise of right-wing extremist groups and individuals over the last decade. The terrorist threat has evolved significantly over the past 20 years, the last 2 decades. There are new actors and new transnational movements of concern. We also see hate crime and hate speech on the rise, and we see the use of conspiracies, fake news, and disinformation by a number of extremists and extremist groups. We've seen the question of trust being raised in relation to the governments and its citizens worldwide, affecting not only domestic efforts, but also multilateral efforts. The multilateral system to deal with these challenges has evolved. As has been mentioned, we see a number of new platforms where these issues are discussed, where new actors are involved and continuously included, both regionally and globally. All this as a backdrop makes the Secretary General's report on the common agenda extremely interesting and very timely. How can we seize on this momentum? How can we make sure that we have an even better agenda for the future? While the Secretary General does not really touch on counterterrorism at the UN per se in his report, the concepts and the themes have arguably direct impact on counterterrorism and violent extremism. It can also be seen as an opportunity to strengthen our resolve at the multilateral level to address key issues of the important prevention and security work at the UN. The Secretary General calls for a more comprehensive and holistic view of global security, a more holistic approach, a more whole of society approach. He also calls for investing in prevention. Here, a key is understanding the underlying drivers to violent extremism and terrorism. He also calls for cooperation, importantly, across the many UN entities, but also with new partners. In other words, a more inclusive agenda. For many of us, this has been a cornerstone to any prevention of extremism and CT work that we've already been involved in. I've had the privilege of working on 2 national action plans against violent extremism and radicalization here in Norway. I've also seen how this work has inspired others around the world to design action plans that are truly inclusive and holistic. I know for a fact how important it is that new partners must be involved, truly involved in policy making, be they civil society or, importantly, the private sector. Youth, girls, and women must be part of the center of policies. We say and we say again, as part of the solution and brought into the work to shape our policies also in this area. Some of the tools to addressing these issues we already know. We have organizations who have and who work on these issues from multilateral settings, be it the Global Counterterrorism Forum, Strong Cities Network, Nordic Safe Cities, Global Center on Cooperative Security, WASL, ICANN, and others, networks of resources and lessons for us to pick up on, who work closely on the ground, with ears to the ground, with youth and women, with civil society and academics, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. Many of these are already our partners. Importantly, there will continue to be a need for multilateral action to deal with transnational terrorist security threats. But arguably, what is also needed is better, maybe more responsive applications of existing tools. We need to use these existing tools, engage with the organizations that are there, that we know, whilst also becoming better at identifying gaps that are out there. Another key issue brought up by the Secretary General in his report is a call for the renewal of the social contract. An important point, if anything, is the work. It relates to my point on cooperation with the wider society. Firstly, a new social contract anchored in human rights. We know that at the key of any prevention work or any counter-terrorism work must lie policies in line with agreed upon human rights standards, international humanitarian law, and international law. Now, renewing the social contract is also key to building back the vital trust in the wake of an era of distrust that has only become stronger during the pandemic. An era of fake news, false news, disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy ideas. Now, unfortunately, we know extremists thrive on these tendencies. Here again, partnerships between governments, civil society, researchers is important. I will leave this for now, Jason, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leila. We'll now turn to Mr. Greg Hines, who's joining us here in person. He is the Director of Counterterrorism at INTERPOL. Greg, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jason. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good day to you all. And as Interpol's Counterterrorism Director, I'm pleased to be with you today. Firstly, let me acknowledge and thank the permanent missions of the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Norway for co-hosting this important event today. Together with the Global Centre for Cooperative Security and all other partners present today, I want to recognise the significance of coordinating international efforts in addressing current and future challenges faced by our communities, including the threat of terrorism. As warned by Secretary General Guterres in his report, Our Common Agenda, we are indeed at an inflection point. Almost 2 years after the start of the global pandemic, we all know the destabilising impact it has on our societies and daily lives, and how threats have continued to evolve whilst adapting to these changing and complex times. Reflecting, whilst terrorism can trigger the same devastating effects today on individuals and societies, 9/11 saw the international community unite to counter such threats to international peace and security through the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1373 and related resolutions since that time. As we enter this new decade, I would like us to take stock of the terrorist threat and its potential developments as we see it through the eyes of law enforcement to refocus our shared commitment and resolve to global peace and security. First, terrorism motivated by jihadist ideologies remains a persistent, but is far from being the only global threat. Daesh is regrouping, with sub-Saharan Africa in particular becoming fertile ground for new routes, while Al-Qaeda has preserved its presence in key regions, including Syria. Moreover, since the military withdrawal of Afghanistan, key concerns remain as to whether terrorist groups in theatre will focus on local control and achievements, or will they position Afghanistan as a platform for external operations? Furthermore, the landscape is diversifying, in particular with the rise of extreme right-wing terrorism in Western countries, appearing to involve loose networks and online echo chambers which replace insurgency and territorial control. Homegrown terrorism is also on the rise. We also expect radicalisation to attack cycles to become faster and less predictable. A second threat feature is how fast terrorist modus operandi is crossing physical borders as well as the ideological spectrum. To illustrate, the exploitation of COVID-19 pandemic is a case in point. Whilst governments remain under pressure in their response efforts, terrorist sympathisers and affiliates ranging from far left, right-wing, Daesh and Al-Qaeda inspired groups have been learning and adapting, including activities in both the physical and virtual worlds. Thirdly, we see new technology sparking interest as new uses for terrorist purpose. 3D printed weapons, unmanned aerial systems, zero-day and ransomware are new threats against civil societies, supply chains and critical infrastructure. At the same time, basic tactics and weapons still dominate the global landscape. Ladies and gentlemen, the challenges we face as counterterrorism leaders is to respond to the threat of today while getting ready for that of tomorrow. We need to remain vigilant in our collective efforts. Just as counterterrorism efforts have substantially evolved and grown within the UN, so have they at Interpol. From an Interpol perspective, counterterrorism means supporting police investigations and joining the dots across countries and continents in preventing and fighting crime and terrorism through enhanced cooperation and continued innovation. In the years following 9/11, Interpol established one of its most substantial contributions to counterterrorism, its secure communication system, I-24/7, which connects police for a safer world. In each of Interpol's 195 member countries lies a national central bureau, giving authorised personnel access to I-24/7, which hosts our 19 databases entailing over 100 million counterterrorism related records. And it allows law enforcement to send sensitive and urgent communications to their counterparts in real time. Countering terrorism requires a whole of society approach, and law enforcement is a large part of this. Partnering with Interpol is a sound investment in supporting its membership in countering the threat of serious organised crime and terrorism. Just as we address the threat of terrorism in a coordinated and comprehensive manner when adopting UN Security Council Resolution 1373, it is equally important that the UN family and international organisations, including Interpol, partner in activities and initiatives to provide a more integrated, comprehensive and cohesive response. It is time to galvanise global solidarity. In concluding, thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing our cooperation with partners within the global security architecture in order to help societies become more resilient to the challenges of tomorrow and playing our part in our common agenda. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Greg, for this terrific remarks. Our final panelist for the day is Ms. Fatima Ashkira. Fatima is the founder and executive director of the Borno Women's Development Initiative in Nigeria. Fatima, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good evening from Nigeria. I appreciate this kind invite, and I especially thank the Norwegian mission, the UAE Global Center, and the Interpol. This afternoon, I want to bring to you the cries from women and girls kidnapped in Nigeria, taken by force, raped, brutalized, broken, stripped of all their dignity, especially here in the north of Nigeria. Things are really, really pretty bad at the moment. We've seen situations where testimonies are coming from women who were in the same situation a few years ago, and this is currently trending in Nigeria, and we hope the message is being taken far and we are being heard loud and clear. The Northeast, as highlighted, is already ridden by Boko Haram with a constant attack here and there. The situation is not any better, as we've seen villages, towns still being razed. We have also seen a lot of abductions and kidnaps on our highways, on roads that are linking people to livelihood access. In the Northwest, it is a similar situation by bandits and criminals, and it's still ongoing. Women and children, however, remains the key and at the center, the receiving end, and the most affected in the situation. Northern Nigeria, as we are aware, is already faced with multiple challenges, especially with high poverty rates. And this has been due to many other issues, including environmental degradation, low literacy, and of course, ideologies that has pushed the Boko Haram agenda for a long while now. I would not present a paper per se. I would talk from my heart. I would talk about the current situation in the country. I would talk about how counterterrorism in the country is currently and what is, of course, needed to strengthen that effort. We've seen a tone of thousands of surrendering Boko Haram here in Maiduguri, especially. These people, we've seen them surrendered and come in, and government receiving them, and even being treated with more dignity than many of our IDPs that are within different IDP camps. We are currently experiencing a resettlement plan by the government. However, we are not still sure if these communities are really safe for people to go and live. If people are returning back to these communities, what is the access to livelihood when Boko Haram are still within their villages, they are still within their areas of farmlands, and this is, of course, basic economic livelihood for the people here in Borno State where I live. We've seen efforts, but we are not sure what plan is there to de-radicalize the surrendered Boko Haram members, as well as what is the mechanism in ensuring that we're integrating them back into the community with the buy-in of the people, as well as settling existing grievances and grudges that are existing within the community. This effort we've seen single-handedly done by the government. We are not sure, or I can speak again for myself, I am not sure if civil society organizations at the grassroots level, at local level are integrated or are being carried along towards actualizing the processes of this reintegration and rehabilitation of surrendered Boko Haram factions that we are dealing with currently. We've also witnessed the shrinking spaces of CSOs to participate in decisions, especially to deal with counterterrorism efforts, as well as all efforts that would deal to prevention of violent extremism, as well as the counter efforts of violent extremism. I don't know, forgive me if I am wrong in understanding some of these terminologies, because I'm a grassroots person and I work with people directly, and I understand only from the language the people talk with at the grassroots. One of those things is we are not really clear what plan it is in the Nigerian context, especially speaking in the Northeast, because it remains unclear and it remains a little bit shady of how these processes are being done. And of course, with the many scenarios the previous speakers highlighted, highlighted, a lot of lessons are being drawn from other countries or currently being drawn in countries that are affected by by violent extremism. I would talk about community concerns in terms of the resettlement plan, and in efforts to counter terrorism, we have to make sure that in integration, we are making the right step towards ensuring healing process, towards integrating trauma, towards trauma healing and psychosocial support, and ensuring that the communities are really ready to accept terrorists back. Are we doing enough in the Nigerian context? What is the framework? What do we have on ground? What do our people have to fall back on? This is a question I think I'm posing to all of us to deal with and look at how we are really looking at this holistically. I would talk about the influence the ISWAP or the Boko Haram are gaining from the northern Nigeria. And part of this is, of course, access to livelihood. People need to go to farmlands. People need to rear animals to eat. People need to gain livelihood. However, this is not possible. We've seen exploitations whereby people pay dues in rural communities for access to their own farmlands. We've seen processes where these people would mount illegal checkpoints, would mount illegal roadblocks, where even us from the humanitarian side cannot deliver food items, cannot deliver food support until we gain a heavy military escort in one way or the other. And this, I'm sure, it's something to really pause and think about. For me, I think there is still a space to ensure we are engaging civil society organizations, bringing people with the knowledge from the grassroots perspective, not just to check the box on the table, but really to do the real groundwork and ensuring that we are penetrating all of these loopholes that we are seeing from the different axes. In terms of solutions, I think it is very, very important that we call on the Nigerian government, not only calling to make the statement, but ensure that we are following up, not only in terms of capacity of our armed forces, but ensuring that they have the right knowledge, they have the right capacity, they have the right approach towards the counterterrorism effort. They must be advised in a way to destroy equipment when necessary, because we've seen scenarios whereby Boko Haram retrieve their ammunition from our Nigerian army and then use it against ordinary citizens. We've also seen scenarios whereby our young people who are energetic, who are willing to go on the field, to go on this battle, but they do not have the right skill, they do not have the right support, they do not have the right machines, avenues to face all of those terrorists. And this in its own self is, again, an issue and a gap that we see in terms of the Boko Haram crisis here in Nigeria. These young people have done significantly good by sacrificing themselves, by putting themselves at the forefront, by leading this war. But then what is their take home? How many of them were absorbed into the military? How many of them were absorbed into systems that are paying them back? What I see is, with the recent structure, if we are not really paying attention to this, is another breeding of another issue. And that would, again, bring, I can say, a reverse in all the efforts that we've been through. I would stop here. I am sure this is just coming from a laywoman. This is coming from somebody who is actually every time in the community. And I hope the voices of these women and children that are constantly being raped and brutalized by terrorists in northern Nigeria would be taken very seriously and would be supported in all areas of the United Nations, as well as particularly in the office of the UNOCT. Thank you again for the opportunity to say this evening, and over to you, the moderator.
Thank you, Fatima, for that fantastic interventions, for sharing your experiences from Nigeria. And I understand there's been some discussion also in the online chat, or questions rather, pertaining to approaches in the Sahel, and for how our common agenda could perhaps inform a specific Sahel plan that respects human rights and engages civil society. What I'd like to do in the time that remains is well, first thank our panelists for their excellent presentations, but now open things up, provide an opportunity for those in the room and those joining us virtually provide any comments or questions or interventions that they would like. In terms of an order of operations, perhaps we could open it up to those of you in the room if you have any comments or questions, and then turn to some pre-registered questions that we have queuing up from the virtual floor. So turning to the room first, any comments or questions for our speakers or interventions that you'd like to share? Hearing none, we will move to the virtual floor and open it up to them. In terms of my pre-registered commenters, I have first on the list Ambassador Mohammed Amir Khan, the Deputy Permanent Representative with the Permanent Mission of Pakistan to the UN. I turn the floor over to you. Hearing nothing, I'm assuming there's a technical issue or miscommunication there. We'll turn to our next speaker with the apologies, bear with me here. With the Permanent Mission of Peru, the Deputy Permanent Rep there, Luis Urgarelli. Can I turn the floor to you if we're able to connect you?
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jason. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for convening this important meeting, and to the panelists for their insights and their complete and informative presentations. In line, as it was recalled by the Secretary General in our common agenda, Peru is firmly convinced in the necessity of a strengthened multilateralism and international cooperation to prevent and counter terrorism. In this regard, Peru also shares the vision of the Secretary General's latest report, in the sense that holistic approach firmly rooted in human rights standards and the rule of law is required. We especially believe in the necessity to concentrate our effort on reducing the conditions and circumstances conducive to the radicalization of individuals through the construction of a culture of peace, dialogue, and ethical values that reduce the personal motivations that lead the violence. Furthermore, the use of information and communication technologies also represents a significant challenge for the international community. In seeking to limit the use of social networks and the internet by terrorist groups, we must also improve the capacity of states to use ICTs with the support of the United Nations agencies involved to limit platforms to propagate and disseminate hate speech by those groups. Finally, in the fight against terrorism, we must remain together and strengthen our collective response with the continued support of the United Nations, and consider that it is important to take appropriate measures to address the new and emerging terrorist threats on the basis of xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance, or in the name of religion or belief, to build a more inclusive society. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And just so we're clear on the order of operations, in terms of the next speakers, I have a list of people who have indicated a desire to intervene. First, I have Yasmin, the National Coordinator in Tunisia for the Human Security Collective, Kyle Beaulieu, CV Senior Advisor with USAID, Nicholas Spang, who is a CT expert with the EU delegation to the UN, Ambassador Khan, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Pakistan, and Rajesh with the Permanent Mission of India to the UN, and finally, Noreen Chowdhury Fink, the Executive Director of the Sufan Center. So we'll begin taking those commenters in that order, and depending on how much time is available, we may select, provide the opportunity for additional speakers, but given the limited time, we may have to call it there. So next, turning to Yasmin with the Human Security Collective. Yasmin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. My intervention will be very brief and based on my work as a practitioner working with youth on youth leadership and inclusive leadership in several countries in the MENA region. While what we observe is that there is more and more acknowledgement and for the importance of the inclusion of civil society, of youth, of women in prevention of violent extremism and countering terrorism. But yet, one of the questions that we find ourselves very often thinking about, reflecting about, having to address is how can we make inclusion not a project-bound or a time-bound thing, not anecdotal or something symbolic where youth are taking along with the pictures and in a meeting, but are not there at the table when policies are being designed. How can we make inclusion part of the way the system works? Through our work, we have tried to reach youth that are hard to reach, to step out of the bubbles that civil society and many other practitioners are finding themselves in. And we have tried to work with youth who are angry, who have a lot of grievances, and who are most vulnerable to the root causes of violent extremism, and working in the communities that are most vulnerable to violent extremism. But we have tried to listen to them with empathy, and to treat them as the experts they are, to get them at the table with the policy makers. But still, again, every time we see that the biggest challenge at the end of these types of projects is that how can we ensure that the participation is not is more systematic than one-time events or a few-time events, and bounded by time, the end and the beginning and the end of projects. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Yasmin, for underlining those points about the importance of youth and inclusion generally, which is obviously, I think, a challenge, an inherent challenge for a multilateral system that is inherently a group of states. So bringing all the other actors into that system that need to be engaged in these efforts is obviously a critical challenge. Given the limited time that we have, I just want to remind our remaining commenters if we could stick to just a minute or two so we can get through as many interventions as possible. I'd greatly appreciate it. Our next commenter is Kyle Beaulieu, who, as I mentioned, is the CBE Senior Advisor with USAID. Kyle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jason. Good morning, good evening, colleagues. My name is Kyle Beaulieu with the U.S. Agency for International Development. I serve as a Countering Violent Extremism Senior Advisor in the Bureau for Asia and cover specifically Pakistan. So it's an honor to be followed by Ambassador Khan, so I'll be as brief as possible. I've shared in the chat our agency's new CVE policy. At the core of this new policy is reducing the risk of recruitment into and support for violent extremism. We focus on building the capacity and commitment of our partners, many of which are represented by your governments, NGOs, civil society, and youth organizations, and the private sector to prevent and counter the VE threats they face. And as Yasmin just noted, our agency is particularly focused on the reasons for why young people are angry, rather than simply telling them they shouldn't be angry. Our experience over the past 20 years in countering violent extremism has crystallized three major perspectives. The efforts to see VE have become smarter on what works, but we are humbler in the face of the resilience of key terrorist adversaries, the brands, and the strength of their following, particularly exacerbated in the time of COVID-19. Terrorist groups have evolved, learned, and exploited the environment during the past few years. They're now entrenched in a number of major areas, and we lack a good answer for how a particular conflict ends. And lastly, we note that the legal toolkit and the range of resources and capabilities built post 9/11 terrorist attacks, as many of the speakers have already noted, is inadequate with dealing with the range of challenges, the vast array of extremist groups, and the depth of their ability to influence host populations. The only recommendation I would put on the table, and then I'll turn to others' remarks, are to consider how peace negotiations and peace building can be further integrated into the CT architecture, looking for how terrorist conflicts with, for example, the Irish Republican Army were ended by converting them into a political party. How could we follow a model like that in other contexts? And with that, I yield my time. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kyle. Next speaker on my list, I have Ambassador Khan, the DPR Deputy Perm Rep of Pakistan to the UN. Ambassador Khan.
Thank you, Jason. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good night. I would like to thank organizers for arranging this event. The Secretary General's report on our common agenda has put forward several new concepts and proposals which deserve close consideration and discussion by the member states. We appreciate comments by panelists and look forward to further discussions at the appropriate forums. Allow me to make few quick comments today. Addressing the threat of terrorism requires a comprehensive approach dealing with not only its symptoms, but also its underlying root causes, especially by resolving prolonged, unresolved conflicts, foreign occupation, and denial of the right to self-determination. The real challenge in combating international terrorism is in our inability to mobilize the political will at the international level for implementation of actions and decisions aligned with the UN Charter's principles and purposes. Our agenda for the future should start with ensuring implementation of the past and existing agreements, and by securing effective and equitable implementation of the numerous commitments, especially those relating to current crises, conflicts, and disputes, and the challenges to economic and social development at the national, regional, and international levels. We note SD's commitment to invest in prevention of conflicts and think he has considerable authority under the Charter to conflict and dispute resolution, which he must utilize judiciously. Looking toward the future, our focus should also remain on identifying the new and emerging threats in context of the global counterterrorism landscape. One of the most serious manifestations of such new and emerging terrorist threats is in the form of increasing number of terrorist attacks on the basis of Islamophobia, racism, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance by violent nationalist, far-right, and other such groups and ideologies. Appropriate changes, therefore, must be made in the global counterterrorism architecture, including the UN security sanctions regime, to address the new and emerging terrorist threats on the basis of Islamophobia, racism, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance, as well as to end stigmatization of Islam and Muslims. The Counterterrorism Committee and the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate have a crucial role to play in this regard, including by closely monitoring the growing and evolution of such terrorist groups and ideologies, developing a better understanding of this discourse, and identifying ways to strengthen member states' laws, capacities, and responses against such groups, including by countering their financing, addressing the transnational threat posed by them. The unanimously adopted 7th review of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy calls upon member states to take appropriate measures to address these new and emerging threats. Our common agenda, therefore, should aim at initiating further actions towards adopting the existing counterterrorism architecture and tools towards addressing such challenges. We understand that under the resolution adopted by the General Assembly A/76/6 on 18th of November 2021, The member states have requested the Secretary General to inform member states and to engage in broad and inclusive consultations with them, all parts of the United Nations system and other relevant partners on his proposals in this regard. So we look forward to have these discussions at the relevant forums. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador Khan. Our next speaker is Nicholas Spang with the EU delegation. Nicholas.
Thank you very much. And let me begin by thanking you, organizers of this important event, for your commitment to follow up the implications of our common agenda on our joint efforts to prevent and counter terrorism and violent extremism. Our common agenda takes a broad approach to address the living conditions of people, not only of those who live today, but also future generations. The recommendations to bridge the global inequalities gap in all its dimensions, the need to rebuild trust by renewed social contracts anchored in human rights and the rule of law, the focus on gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls right at the center, it all serves the interests of preventing and countering terrorism. With reference to the global CT strategy, the principles of social justice, inclusion, and equal opportunities promotes open and resilient societies. Many actions that needs to be taken, as expressed in the recommendations, do not fall within the scope of traditional counterterrorism. However, while still being highly relevant to counter the root causes of terrorism, it reminds us the need to take a multi-agency approach and to establish partnership with the civil society and the private sector. We cannot achieve the goals of the CT strategy without enabling their important contribution. And the Christchurch call serves as a good example of what can be achieved together. The Secretary General's call for a more sustainable financial footing for the human rights mechanism is very much in line with the EU's priorities. We must ensure that the human rights are prioritized, and that was also EU's approach in the 7th review of the Global CT strategy, to ensure human rights mainstreaming in all the global compact work, as well as the inclusion of the role of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The enhanced collaboration with youth as representing the future generation is vital, and the EU welcomes the intention to upgrade the UN envoy on youth to a full-fledged and properly staffed UN Youth Office. Youth have an important role in promoting peace and security, and thus in preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism. To conclude, counterterrorism as a cross-cutting subject benefits from its focus on improved conditions for people in the world. The contrary is often referred to as root causes for terrorism. EU stays committed to engage in multilateralism based on its principles of human rights and gender equality in all the domains conducive to the prevention and countering of terrorism and violent extremism. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicholas. I understand we also have an intervention pending from the permanent mission of India to the UN, but I think from a in-person intervention. Okay, the technical team was wondering why you hadn't accepted the invite to be a panelist, and that's because you're sitting at the end of the table. Please go ahead.
Thank you for giving me the floor, and I would like to again thank permanent missions of Norway, United Arab Emirates, Global Center, and Interpol for this panel discussion. And I also thank the briefers for their remarks. The report of the Secretary General on our common agenda covers many substantial issues which the world is facing today and which need our collective attention and action. Unfortunately, it neglects some of the crucial issues, which if not addressed, will have significant implication on international peace and security. One of such issues is the threat of terrorism. It would not be an exaggeration if we say that the biggest threat which the world faces today is the threat of terrorism. We know that Secretary General has given very high importance to counterterrorism. Secretary General's biannual report on ISIL, as well as monitoring team's biannual report on threat of ISIL and Al-Qaeda, have been clearly indicating that threat of terrorism is growing in its strength and to new areas. The fast expansion of terrorism in many parts of Africa is a real cause of concern.
ISIL and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups have continued to target innocent civilians and security forces. No need to say that women, children, and other such vulnerable groups have been the worst affected by terrorism. We heard Ms. Fatima Askira about how Boko Haram is targeting women in part of Nigeria. Besides, we have seen recent developments in Afghanistan, which is going to have serious security implications for the people of Afghanistan, the region, and the world as a whole. However, these issues have not reflected adequately in the report. So any breakthrough or breakdown scenario, as SG has put it, has to do with terrorism. We have been talking about African leadership for the solution of the African problems. While we commend the efforts of African countries in preventing and combating terrorism, however, they face capability limitations and therefore their efforts need sustainable and effective international support. The countries of the region continue to raise the issue of sustainable support, UN support to regional security initiatives. The Secretary General himself has ardent supporter of providing sustainable financial support to these security initiatives through UN's assessed contribution. However, this aspect as well is completely missed in the report. We know that the issue is difficult to address, but such issues do not qualify for being precluded from any future-looking agenda. They have to be at the heart and center of such agenda. Going forward, it is important that all future consideration of the report's recommendation is done in an inclusive, transparent, and member state-led process. India will be an active and constructive participant in any such process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And given the time, I think we'll have to turn to our final speaker from the floor, Ms. Noreen Fink, who's the Executive Director of the Soufan Center. Noreen, are you there?
Yes, I am. Well, thank you, Jason, and to colleagues at the Global Center and the UAE mission and the mission of Norway for the opportunity to speak and for a really interesting discussion. I'll be really quick. I know I'm standing between you and the little red leave button. I think just one thing I wanted to point out is that we've talked a lot about underlying conditions and knock-on effects and some of the wider issues about the social contract that have been raised in our Common Agenda report. What we've talked less about is how this has actually intersected with UN counterterrorism efforts. In some ways, we've seen that over the past 2 decades, counterterrorism efforts have inadvertently, or in some cases deliberately, I'm sorry to say, sometimes contributed to these very factors. And there are questions about how we think about the impacts of counterterrorism measures. And then I think the second, more procedural, but nonetheless important question is how these big issues then relate back to the UN's specific counterterrorism work. We know that there are about 40 agencies, funds, and programs that have a mandate to address many of these issues. What is less clear is on how UNOCT and particularly CTED's work contributes and plays into these in a way that has a comparative advantage over the other UN agencies that are active on the ground. So this is too big a question, I think, for the end of a meeting like this, but I did just want to leave with that point that our common agenda really highlights a lot of critical issues that are likely to fuel grievances and dynamics that will feed terrorist groups, insurgent groups, and other forms of conflict. I think we need to do a better job on all our ends to think a little bit about how the work that we are asking the UN to do, whether it's through UNOCT or whether it's through CTED, and particularly through the Security Council, because we know that, a lot of those binding resolutions create mandatory tasking, and it's not always clear whether that tasking is actually addressing the challenges that have been highlighted today. So to think a little bit about the UN's role in both contributing to and mitigating these dynamics, particularly through its counterterrorism work, and second, how we connect the UN's counterterrorism work to some of these big dynamics that are outlined in our common agenda. I think that's kind of the homework for all of us going forward. Thank you, Jason and colleagues.
Thank you so much, Noreen. And I think those are some great points to end on. I want to thank all of our panelists for your excellent interventions, all of our participants as well for your interventions, and everybody else for attending as well. I think it was a very rich and wide-ranging discussion. And I am now honored to turn the floor over to our Norwegian co-hosts for the final word and introduce Mr. John Christian Muller, who's a counselor and Deputy Chief of Police. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jason and colleagues. First, on behalf of the co-hosts, let me once again thank you, our panelists, for their excellent contributions to our discussion today. Particular thanks to our excellent moderator, Jason, which I know started this day at 4 o'clock this morning in Washington. So thank you for coming over. Also to thank United Arab Emirates for your hospitality and hosting us here today. I also like to thank all other colleagues who joined us either virtually or physically and participated in this very substantive Q&A. I think the engagement we have seen here today illustrates the importance of our common agenda as a broad and bold vision statement for the UN. It has strategic implications across the entire organization, and counterterrorism is no exception. While the report itself does not explore this issue in detail, today's discussion has shed light on the numerous interlinkages between the agenda and the UN counterterrorism efforts. And I think just one good example in that regard is how cross-cutting the counterterrorist work has to be, including just, for example, all the SDGs and definitely a whole of society approach, as we heard several speakers mentioning here today. I would briefly like to sum up a few of the connections that I found most striking during our conversation. First, the agenda's commitment to renewing the social contract between governments and their people is a critical aspect of successful counterterrorism. Inclusive and accountable governing institutions that promote human rights, uphold the rule of law, not at least, empower all segments of society, and fulfill people's basic needs is crucial for addressing underlying grievances and drivers of radicalization. If terrorism at the most basic level is motivated by perceptions of government as illegitimate, then strengthening the social contract and thereby government legitimacy is the most effective and sustainable counterterrorism strategy. Second, and relatedly, our common agenda's focus on youth engagement is directly relevant for counterterrorism efforts. I mean, I just want to highlight also the youth grassroots perspective we heard from Ms. Fatima Askira here today. I think that's a really touching statement, and it also reminds me about a recent field visit I had to a country with big challenges with recruitment to terrorism. As we heard from a grassroots representative in that country, a lot of the youth actually have more to gain to join a terror organization than to get a job, which I think says a lot. As youth are very particularly vulnerable to political and economic marginalization, we know that they are also the most susceptible to radicalization. We need to strengthen mechanisms both within and outside the UN to facilitate the meaningful engagement of youth, particularly young women, in political decision-making processes at the local, national, and international level. The establishment of a UN Special Envoy for Youth is therefore a very interesting recommendation in this regard, and one that may help amplify the voices of creative and courageous young activists like Ms. Askira. Third, the Secretary General's vision of more networked, inclusive, and effective multilateralism has the potential to greatly boost international counterterrorism cooperation. This is a multilateralism that strategically engages affected stakeholders on all levels to increase transparency and local ownership in the design and application of counterterrorism measures. It strengthens mechanisms to monitor and evaluate their impact, including on human rights and civic space. And third, continues to break down the silos between the UN security, development, and human rights pillars, focusing our efforts on conditions conducive to terrorism, while also enhancing cooperation between headquarters and the field. And in that regard, I also want to echo Ms. Laila Bukhari, emphasizing that the evolving threat landscape we see today must be met by global multilateralism. And in that regard, the Secretary General's common agenda is very timely. These are just a few of the points of convergence that have emerged during today's discussion on our common agenda and UN counterterrorism efforts. I will also, just in my last minutes here, emphasize also how the UNODC emphasized the climate changes as one of the driving factors with recruitment to violent extremism, which should not be forgotten. I look forward to further exploring these and other synergies as the international community continues to engage with the Secretary General's vision. So, colleagues, in conclusion, I would like to once again thank our excellent panel, as well as other participants, for your contribution today. Once again, I just want to thank you again, the United Arab Emirates, for hosting us, and to the Global Center and our good colleagues in Interpol for your support organizing this event. And I wish all of you a pleasant day. Thank you very much.